Shut up and sit down.
Alright guys, this is Bigmeks Workshop and Painting Studio. I'm Dodge, and this is the first in our Shadow Spear set of painting tutorials, and we're starting with the Suppressor. Very cool fig, although I did see there wasn't much going on with him. He's mainly a very large gun, so we're going to spend more time painting the gun chain and the gun than the actual armour itself. And for the armour, we've decided we're going to go for Flesh Tearers, as it's something we haven't done yet, and it's going to be a bit darker than the Space Marines, although you could use this for Space Marines depending on your taste. So firstly, we've gone for Vallejo Black Primer. As always, anyone who watches our channel knows that's what we tend to use, and this first colour is Scale 75's Tandalol Red. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It comes from the Fantasy range, Scale 75. We're going to give a nice coat of the top of that. Let some of that black show through, because it being a Flesh Tearer, we're going to want a dark red. I've not tried a red this dark before. We've got a few other things we're going to try later on, and mix it up later on for some word bearers or something else. Next is Scale 75's Deep Red. You will find, guys, that I'm using a lot of Scale 75s in this one, and that's because we've just bought a new set of red Scale 75s. If you haven't tried them yet, I would highly recommend them. They are brilliant through the airbrush, as you can see how fine that's coming through there. No problems at all. And they're even better for glazing than any other paint I find. Absolutely brilliant for glazing because of the such small pigment that they have. So get yourself a set and check them out. They're definitely worth it. As you can see, this colour's quite pastel-y, quite muted, so we're going to warm it up. And what we're going to use is Army Painter Red Tone. And we're not using this as a wash. We are using this as a glaze, so there's not too much on that brush there. We don't really want it pooling in the recesses, although we can fix that later using washers and a pin wash, which is something we always tend to do with nearly every single model on our channel. So it may look a bit flat, but when you see the end where we put it on the Lazy Susan, you'll notice that yeah, it's all a lot sharper now. Now I'm going back to the Scale 75's Deep Red. And we're going to switch to just the brush from here on out, guys. You could do all the other stuff that I did with the airbrush with a brush. It would just take longer, and I've got 3 days to edit this up, and well, paint it up and edit it up, so on a bit of a time scale here to get all the videos out in time. And this is just being glazed up and down in the hot spot areas, basically where the airbrush had already hit them, but we're going to bring them up a little further over the glaze that we've done. I did notice that the pigment had not fully dried as well at this point, as you can see on that shoulder pad there, but that's not a drama. But that's what that shape is, that patch. It's where I've not let it fully dry before glazing, and it's moved the underneath pigment around. This is Null Oil by Games Workshop, and this time we are using it as a wash, and we want it to sit in the recesses just to add some depth, and also some transitions to the lower areas of the armour. I decided it was time to start picking out what else we're going to use on the palette. As you can see, we've got a nice deep red. I'm going to use Vallejo's Black Primer with a brush, because as we're always saying, you can use all the airbrush paints with a paintbrush. Sometimes you will find them better than the GW paints. I'm going to black out the gun and anything that I want to be detailed. I wasn't sure about the backpack, but I did decide to go for a black backpack. And as this is Flesh Tearers, we're going to want the inside of the shoulder pad there to be black as well. Once that's all done, we're going to mix Scale 75's Deep Red with Scale 75's Blood Red. And start bringing in some of the highlights, because once I put the black on, I could see how flat the armour still was. So this is all glazing techniques here, so there's barely anything on my brush. And I'm just pushing it around ever so slightly, just to the starting in the shaded areas and bringing it up to the highlights. Next is Negro Grey by Scale 75. You'll have seen me do this on one of the previous videos. It's almost the same colour combination I did for the Chaplain, but the Negro Grey works really well over the black as a highlight. Although it is quite difficult to get a smooth highlight on these shoulder pads because of the shape and the glazing technique, but Just keep working at it. If it goes too bright, we're going to wash it down later on, and that'll smooth out any brush strokes or any bits of paint you're not too happy with. Now I'm going to add a little bit of dawnstone into that negro grey, and as you can see, it's a very small amount. It actually looks like the light from my from my desk is what's causing that grey reflection, and that's what you want. You want it to look like the desk light's bouncing off the black, but no, it's actually the greys slowly building up now and building a nice transition. Now, you can see on that shoulder pad, it's not 100% smooth, but I knew I was going to do this anyway. This is Decay Black by Scale 75, and this time instead of glazing upwards, we're basically going to glaze down. It is a glaze, don't try and do it as a wash. That's going to put a filter over all those greys and any bits that didn't quite match up. Now going to end up a bit smoother, and it's going to make the transition a little bit easier on the eye. Now, onto the gun, I decided that if I did this whole thing black, it'd just be black and red and there'd be not much for you to see. So I decided to go for a sort of off green black for the gun, just to add a bit of a colour transition, and for that I started with Despair Green by Scale 75. On anything that looks like the casing for the gun, the outer casing is going to be based in this colour. Although it didn't show up too well, and we're going to layer some other colours over the top of it, so you could essentially skip that step. Next is Model Air Metallic Gunmetal, because the Model Air Metallic range is absolutely brilliant. You should definitely have some of those on your desk, try them out, you won't be disappointed. It's basically Games Workshop's lead belcher, but it's a lot smoother and easier to apply. As we were saying at the beginning of this video, the gun is a very large feature of this model, otherwise it's just a Marine, so we've got to do quite a bit of work on this one. And I tried to figure out a way of making these gun belts quick and easy to paint, and I got it down to about half an hour for this paint job. So I started with wall block bronze. And half an hour on the gun belt may seem excessive, but then the gun only took an hour and a half on its own. In total, I think, something like that. But this is just a base layer, and we're just going to go over the middle parts. We're not going to work our way into the recesses, that's because this is going to save us some time. And while that's drying, I'm going to use Bugman's Glow to start picking out what you can see of the face on this model, as he's got a like rebreather or some form of mask. I'm assuming it's for oxygen, as he's got a jetpack on, and he's probably going to be whizzing around all over the place. You could probably use some eye protection as well, to be honest. After that, we're going back to... No, we're going to use Rhinox Hide, because I'm waiting for things to dry anyway. Rhinox Hide is always good as a leather base colour against anything that's red. It's a nice warm colour and a good base. You could also use Dryad Bark if you wanted to, for a colour that's a little bit more flat. But for Space Marines I wanted something a bit more rich and a bit more regal looking. Morning Fang Brown is going to be the base for... I can't even tell what I'm painting there. Morning Fang Brown is the base for the Purity Seals. You've seen me do this one before, I think, quite a few times. There's not much to show here, as there's only 2 Purity Seals on this particular model. But as you look around the model, you do realise there's more and more details that I missed. I noticed towards the end. Right, back onto the gun, and we are on to Brass Scorpion. And basically, I'm not covering the whole thing here. I'm covering the top parts of the top parts of each of this bit of chain. It's a very quick line. I've only sped this up twice the speed, so it's pretty much half the speed of this. It's the real time, so all I'm doing is the top halves and then feathering, doing the top line and then feathering it back up to itself. So you've got the Warp Lock Bronze and the Brass Scorpion there, and you're going to have a bit of a hard line. That's absolutely fine, because we're going to fix that in a minute. And just following those edges round where the light would hit very quickly. Then we're going to use Warp Lock Bronze as a wash. very, very thin, and that's why I'm not too bothered about the hard lines. This is going to help break those up. So this is how I get through these very fast. You can let this sit in the recesses. We are going to go over it. Yeah, I'm basically going to use this as a wash, pull it back down, and it will sit more naturally. Now I'm going to use German Grey by Model Air Metallic to pick out the Aquila. I just wanted a slightly different grey to everything else. I don't know too much about Flesh Terrors. We do have a Space Marine poster with a bunch of the colours on, and I couldn't quite make out whether it was supposed to be black with a hard highlight just because of the art on the photo, or whether it was grey, but I chose to go for a grey just to break up everything else, as we've got quite a high contrast palette at the moment. Next we're going to use an Agrax Earthshade wash across the chain for the gun. This is watered down a little bit, it's probably about 50-50. We're going to gently apply that all over the whole belt. And at this point, those very quick and easy transitions that we put down, because we only did those two base layers, the Brass Scorpion and the Warthog, should really start to blend together now. I spent more time waiting for this belt thing to dry than I did actually painting it. Now I'm going to use Talon Sand for a change, for the seal papers. The reason for that was, well, I'm always using bone. I thought I'd try something else, and the yellow looks like bone anyway. Well, the Talon Sand looks more like bone next to the reds. It's something I'm starting to experiment with, is what's looking like a colour next to something else. As you'll see, I'll use a purpley grey later, but in comparison to the rest of the model, it will look grey. So I'm just tending to go that way with my work and trying some new techniques out. After that, I'm going to mix Runelord Brass with Brass Scorpion, and going to do the quick shapes over the top corners again. As you can see, I'll do the entire top of that one, and as I go around, just do the edges of the other ones. The reason it's a mix of Runelord Brass and Brass Scorpion is so you can visually pick how far you want your highlight to go. It's completely up to you how far you mix that, ratio wise. And after that, I'm just going to use Runelord Brass on its own to finally pick out those edges. And you don't have to follow all the grooves all the way down, just the top grooves at this point, and it'll start to make the whole thing look very three-dimensional. And as I was saying, it took about half an hour to complete this chain. We're not fully done with it, as we're going to pick out some other parts in a minute. Because we have those little joining parts, I wanted to make those stand out a little bit. Those were painted in gunmetal Model Air metallics, and that is all I did to those, because later on we're going to apply more washers and an oil wash. And if you're going to apply an oil wash to this belt, you don't need any more depth, you just need the highlights, and the contrast will do everything else for you. These really don't take very long, it's sort of an overbrush over all those little pins. Just be careful you don't smudge, and if you do, just use a bit of cotton bud or a clean brush to clean that off. Now for the grenades, I decided I'd do Caliban Green as a base, because green's quite complementary to the reds, but they are very muted reds, so I decided to keep the greens quite muted as well. I thought there'd be enough metallics and other colours on there, so green seemed to be the way to go for these. Now doing a little bit more work on the seals. I'm going to pick those up with a a Carrick Stone, and just start picking up the raised areas of those. These particular seals are sculpted very, very well, so you don't have to put too much effort into making them look three-dimensional, as they already are. You just have to hit the top layers and let the darker paint show through in the recesses there. Now back onto the face, which I don't know how in focus that will be. It's quite difficult to get the face on camera. It's Cadian Flesh, and for this I'm following the centre of his forehead, his brows, and he does have quite a large vein, this one, at the side of his head, so I'm going to be following that and bringing that out the whole time as well. With a face like this, with that red mask on, I do prefer to put in the little white eyes before doing too much detail, and then paint around the eyes, leaving the white in there, rather than going back to front, because you risk, smudging white paint onto your skin tones. I'm going to use a colour now from Scale 75 again, called Ryland Grey. I love this colour actually, it's really starting to grow on me. It's the one that I'm basically covering up the other coat that I did with this. This is the one you should have really been using. I wanted to go for it sort of looks like a 50 cal to me, and I want to go for like a sort of off military green 50 cal sort of weapon, as there's more weapon on this model than there is character. And we're going to use that to cover the entire shell of the gun. While that's drying, I'm going to use a Reclam Flesh Shade to bring some tone and warmth back to that skin. You will notice I do touch some of these things up off camera, but it's basically just using the same colours I've already mentioned. I've been doing that quite a lot, especially when rushing a model. So if you suddenly see another colour pop up, it's just one off the palette we've already used. Now for the hair, I decided I'd go Morning Fang Brown as well. I use Morning Fang Brown as a base because it's a good base coat with some warmth to it, and I'll probably make this dude blonde. So he's probably getting a Terra Earth hair. As Terra Earth by Game Color is... well, we'll get to that in a minute anyway. But just be careful while doing the hair not to get any on his skin. I tend to work from the back of the head upwards, and then fill in the little gap that's left where you brush quite in reach. Now that Ryland Grey by Scale 75, I'm going to add Rakarth Flesh to it, and anyone who watches the channel all the time knows I will add Rakarth Flesh to absolutely everything and anything. I wonder if Scale 75 has got a Rakarth Flesh colour. I can start mixing that with everything a lot easier. This is going to be a highlight, not an edge highlight. We're going to start bringing in some extra colour into the top parts of the guns and onto the edges, but when you start the edges with this sort of technique, move back a little bit and pull the colour inwards, otherwise you don't leave yourself anywhere to move when you do edge highlight. I'm going to add an Agrax Earth Shade to the seals. It's quite watered down. I wasn't too worried about the seal detail. They tend to look alright with just a few layers of paint anyway. You can be quite lazy with those. Now back to the hair, we're going to be using Terra Earth by Game Color. It's sort of a brown in the bottle, but when you paint it, it does go a very blondie sort of yellow, a brownish yellow. So all I'm doing here is putting in very small brush strokes and lines, and also mixing up those techniques as it dries. I will take my brush away and I will glaze some of the colour in as well. So you've got this warm undercolour and depth, but it looks like the hairs, lots of little hairs overlaid, and there's a different transition in there, and it's not just painted one block yellow. Model Air Gunship Green is then used to start picking out the tops of the grenades. It wasn't much of a contrast in comparison to the other greens, but the raised areas on the grenades are very small, so I could have used a Winsor Newton here and gone in with that and a bit of Rakarth Flesh to brighten them up a bit more. But you don't have to hit all of those raised areas either, you just need to hit the top ones, and then as your brush runs out of paint, work your way down the grenade to the shaded area, and that will naturally shade for you, so you don't have too much paint on your brush. For the pouches, again a bit of repetition from the Blood Angel one here. Gothor Brown, as it's one of my favourites to highlight the Rhinox hide with when it comes to leather. It does work really well. Even if it's a bit patchy, what you do is you just apply a couple of washes to it and it'll tone it right back down. Again with the Ryland Grey and Rakarth Flesh, but now we're going to add quite a bit more Rakarth Flesh in and start working those edges and the top highlights a lot more. It does look rather green in comparison to everything else at this point. We're going to wash it down and bring it back up a few more times as well. Sometimes you can save yourself a lot of effort in painting if you're going to put a wash on all of the parts at once, as I have not done the metallics here as well, which was sort of pre-planned. And there you go. Now I can just apply a null oil wash to all the metallic parts and all the Ryland grey parts all at once, and make it all unified and look like one solid piece. Now this is watered down because I didn't want to overdo it and make anything too dark. You don't need to do the null oil on the chain belt. The chain belt is pretty much finished at this point. So just be gentle with your brush, and be careful not to overflow the model or drown it with too much wash. And of course this is Ryland grey and Rakarth flesh, but at this point it's mainly Rakarth flesh, and I think that's that for that set of colours. It's basically just an edge highlighter at this point, bringing out the top parts of the gun. And I do like the colour it gets, and the transition you slowly start to get just by mixing the Rakarth flesh with this particular paint. It makes a very muted sort of green, but keeps that very dark base as well. Lots of potential mixing those two paints together. Now we're going back to Gunmetal by Model Air Metallic. Now we're going to start picking out the bits that were already done in Gunmetal, and the bits that were done in Model Air Metallic previously. But we're only going to start picking out the highlights on them. Make sure you don't overflow again or get any in the recesses, as now it's starting to get some 3 dimensions to it, starting to get some real life to the gun. And as I said earlier, I'm starting to mix my colour palette a lot more. This is Warp Fiend Grey by Games Workshop, which is slightly purple, but when you put it next to a red, the reds trick the eye into thinking it's a lot more grey than it is. So you can get away with using these colours alongside other ones. It's something I'm trying to learn at the moment. So I can bring more colours into my palette and be more elaborate with my paint schemes. After that, I'm going to touch up the face again with Kislev flesh, just really picking out that big vein on the side of his head, to be honest, and the centre of his nose at the top where the mask is, because the mask's really attached to his face, and you want to make sure they can tell whoever's looking at it can tell the difference between the mask and the bridge of the nose. So I just thought I'd add that little bit of extra colour around those parts. And to highlight the Aquila on his chest, I'm just using Games Workshop's Dawnstone. And I'm using a Winsor Newton here, trying to overbrush it, although the Winsor Newton doesn't work too well for an overbrush. So I end up following it around. Bit awkward to do when he's got this big beastie gun in the way. For the seals, I decided to go for Zaria's Purple by Games Workshop. Sort of complement the pipes a little bit. We've got greens that complement the reds, so it just sort of matched the palette decent enough. I mean, you don't want to put a red seal really on red marines, it's not going to stand out much. I just wanted to stand out enough for you to be able to see it. Then we're going to use Demonette Hide to highlight that ever so slightly. You can leave a lot of that dark in the centre recess and just follow the outer edges. It's a very simple technique to do this one. Just keep that paint thin enough so you have to go around it a couple of times before it shows up. Then we're going to add, well, I guess you probably could have guessed this one, we're just going to add a small amount of watered down Juicy Violet into the centre and just glaze that around the edges. So the centre's more of a wash and the outside's just a bit of a glaze. That's really going to add some depth to that seal. Now, there are details on this model that I kept missing, such as this weird medallion thing he's got underneath him. I'm not sure what it is, but very quickly, just to finish this bit of video off, as I know it's a long one, is Retributor armor for the other decorative bits, the bits that look like there's some form of trophies or honour items. Because Retributor armour is actually quite a regal and bright gold, although the gold is quite yellowy and contrasts, we are now going to go and stick a Rickle and Flesh Shade wash. This is barely watered down at all. It's watered down enough for the Retributor gold to show through it. I'm going to use a wash of that just to tone those colours down. Then all you need to do, as this little item has got a bunch of front detail, is go back to your gunmetal by Model Air Metallic and do an overbrush on all the feathers and all the other details under there, and it will just pick those out nicely, and at that point you'll be pretty much finished. And there you have him. After the pin wash, all those details really start to pop out a lot more. I probably would have brought up those blacks at the back on the shoulder pads, and unfortunately we don't have the decals for these. Me and Andy need to get some decals in for the channel just so we can make the finished result look even better for you guys. So I hope you liked this video, guys, and I hope you learned something from it. I definitely did. I enjoyed painting that gun quite a lot, and we've got some thank yous, because we wouldn't even have this model if it wasn't for our patrons who just helped buy Shadow Spear so we can do all these tutorials for you. So we got a special thank you to D-Wack, Warren, Love Minis, The Oak Boys, Ludwig Hofbauer, Kit Lindquist, Agnes of Dawn, MTK11 and Mark. You guys are absolutely awesome. You help support this channel. Like I said, you help us get new models, and because of that we've got even more of these tutorials coming out for the Marine players, and then we're going to go back to doing a bit more Chaos probably from the Shadow Spear set. If you haven't got your Shadow Spear set and you're thinking about getting one, check out the links in our description to the Outpost, where you can get 15 to 20% off on hobby supplies including Shadow Spear and other box sets of games. And that's it from us. Thanks very much for watching, guys, and we will catch you in the next one.